texted me. Thank you, by the way, guys. This morning, I know Kevin had texted me, what was it, on Wednesday or Thursday, just really felt impressed. The Spirit told me we're going to really encounter presence today, and I believe it. I'm already sensed that He's here for us to do something. Amen? Amen. Glad to have Chris here playing drums today. I just thought if he wasn't here, we could just have the whole barber playing. But he's like, I'm not coming up there. So have you read Galatians 4 this week? Galatians 4, I know Kevin told me he had. Galatians 4, wow, there's some good stuff in Galatians 4. This is a moment of confession. So, probably up until really we started doing this, I think I had skipped over Galatians 4 because Galatians 5 is really good. And so I think I just always skip Galatians 4. It's just like, oh, there can't be anything worthwhile in there. We'll just jump to Galatians 5 because that's where all the good stuff is. And it is good. We're going to look at Galatians 5 next week. But can I tell you there is some really good stuff in Galatians 4 too. If you've not read it yet, this week, read it 3 times. Read Galatians 4 3 times. Just allow the Spirit to really speak and reveal some things. But I want to share a few things as we look at Galatians chapter 4. But let me just recap, if you've not been here. Last 3 weeks, we've been looking in the book of Galatians on the topic of freedom. Set free. Since Easter, we've been diving into understanding what does it mean to live in the freedom that Jesus has brought us. And so, in other words, freedom is not found in what we do, but what Jesus has done. And that's what we've been trying to understand. It's not about, that's what Paul's trying to tell the church. It's not about what you're trying to do. It's not about, these add-ons. It's not, what do I need to do to be more holy? And so this is where we get the word legalistic. What do I need to do? And it's not about what you need to do, it's about what you need to trust in what Jesus has already done for you. And that's what we've looked at so far, and just remembering that we need to act upon that freedom. That's what Galatians 4 we're going to look at today. How do we act on freedom? Think about it. You have freedom. But do we live and act upon our freedom? I mean, it's just like if we look at our history in our country. We have freedom as a country that was won for us through wars and through lives. We have freedom. But what if we never acted on the freedom that was won? What if instead we just decided we're just going to continue to live in slavery? We're just going to live in bondage and never act upon the freedom that was given. And that's what Paul is in Galatians 4 is really about. Is how do we begin to look at making steps forward to remember to live and act upon freedom that has been given to us. And so I want to start reading in Galatians 4. Once again, this is a long chapter. And so I'm just going to kind of break it up into some sections and pick apart a few thoughts that really stood out to me, share those with you, and pray, Holy Spirit, this morning that my words, it's just my words. We want to know what you have to tell us today. We want to know what you want us to see in your word. And so as we open it up and as we read it and as we study what's been impressed upon our hearts that we need to apply, that we need to live by, I just pray that we'll encounter you today and that you will make these words, your words that you've spoken, take root into our hearts, transform our minds, so that we can better understand your will. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. So let's jump into Galatians chapter 4. Sound good? All right, let's do it. So he continues, verse 4, I think I'm going to back up to the previous verse because he kind of picks up right in the middle of the thought. But he says in verse 29 of chapter 3, and now that you belong to Christ, you are the true children of Abraham. Remember, he closed off with, we're going to look at this discussion again about Abraham. Remember, he's trying to relate with a Jewish crowd, Jewish Christians, who have come and told Gentile Christians that they need to become Jew in order to be accepted to Christ. And so he's going to reference back to the history of the Jews with Abraham. And that's what he does at the end of chapter 3. And so he says that you're true children of Abraham, you're his heirs, and God's promise to Abraham belongs to you. And so he picks up and says, so think of it this way. If a father dies and leaves an inheritance for his young children, those children are not much better off than slaves until they grow up, even though they actually own everything their father had. They have to obey their guardians until they reach whatever age their father set. And that's the way it was with us before Christ came. We were like children. We were slaves to the basic spiritual principles of this world. But when the time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, subject to the law, and God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law, so we could adopt us as his very own children. And because we are his children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, prompting us to call out, Abba, Father. And now you are no longer a slave, but God's own child. And since you're his child, God has made you also an heir. I love that phrase, Abba, Father. In other words, it's an Aramaic word that we can draw from, some people say Papa. It really is this very endearing relationship when we can cry out, Abba, Father. Regardless of what our earthly relationship with fathers down here have been, we can have a different encounter with a Father in heaven. And so Paul says the Spirit allows us to say this endearing, almost as saying Papa. This intimacy that we can have now because of what the Spirit is working in us, that now we can see differently. And this is really the first part of this section as we look at this. Paul is going to point out to us that legalism is going to have this appearance. It gives us the appearance of spiritual maturity, when in reality what legalism does is it leads us back to the second childhood of Christian experience. And that's what he's pointing out here in these first few verses, is understanding that what Christ has done for you, the freedom that he has got you, he's given you through the cross. We can live in that freedom. But what happens with legalism is that it brings you back again to when you were first born into Christ. Let me explain a couple things as detailed by Paul. When you trusted Christ, the moment you trusted Christ and were saved, as far as the condition was concerned, you were what was called a spiritual baby. Spiritual baby. This is what Peter goes on to talk about. We need that spiritual milk. And then he talks about the mature people need meat. But he said you are still taking milk when you should be on meat. In other words, he's showing that when you first get saved, you're what's called a spiritual baby. And just like this precious little baby over here, and the one that we have, they need milk. They need that nourishment right from the beginning to help strengthen them. And that's what Paul is saying here. He's saying when you first you were a spiritual babe that needed to be matured. But your position, this is the different part, but your position when you became a believer, you were positioned into a family as a son. And there's something different about children and son. And he talks about it, that when you had an inheritance, and this was the Roman culture, when you had an inheritance, chapter 4, it said that you did not get it until the time into which the father thought it was time for you, that you were a son. Children did not get the inheritance to act upon, sons did. And so it was at a certain point, Paul says, that you become a child, that you became a son, and you stepped into the inheritance that was for you. but you were underneath a slave, you were underneath a servant, a guardian. It was interesting that he says, you were no better than the slave that was watching over you. And the slave was put in place, or a servant, whichever word you want to use. The servant or slave was put there to help keep you going in the direction that the parents want you to go. And you were, in sense, yes, you were an heir, but you were no different than the servant that was with you, giving you guidance until the proper time for you to step into the inheritance. And that's the picture that Paul is trying to get the Galatians to realize, is that they're still living. When they went back to the law, they were still living as children, when in reality their position was to be a son. We see this in the story of the prodigal son. Luke chapter 15, I'm not going to turn there, but you can note the story. When the younger son takes his inheritance and leaves and goes to the far country, spoils, wastes it all, he eventually comes to his senses, the story tells us, and it said that he came back to himself and said, I need to go back to my father. But do you know, I want you to note that he says, not as a son, he says, I will go back to my father as a servant. And that is what Paul is showing is happening here in the church of Galatia, is that they wanted to be accepted to the Father by being a servant and not by being a son. They had taken what was properly there as a son, the inheritance, the position, and they went back into legalism, which then showed them that they were just children. And so they're living in the resurrection of the Lord, but they're living through the law, not as a son that is stepping into the inheritance that was theirs. And all kinds of havoc begins to take place. Let me read to you 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4. It says this. And because of his glory and excellence, he has given us great and precious promises. These are the promises that enable you to share. Listen to this. Share his divine nature and escape the world's corruption. Share in whose nature? The divine nature. But when they fell back into legalism, when the Jews came in and said, no, you need to follow the law, Paul is saying, no, when you accepted Christ and you became a child of God, you now share into a different nature. But we're finding ourselves wrestling now. The Galatians are wrestling with this tension of whether or not they're a son or if they're a slave or a servant. In other words, when they went back to the law, they went from every spiritual blessing, Ephesians chapter 1, into spiritual bankruptcy. They had everything in the heavenly realms. Everything that the Father, remember what the Father says to the older son in Luke chapter 15, everything that is mine has been yours. Everything the Father has, when you become a son, everything the Father has is now yours. That's awesome. Every inheritance, every spiritual blessing in heaven is now yours through Christ, Ephesians chapter 1. But what happened? Paul is saying, what has happened? You have left that blessing and now you're bankrupt. You've gone back to nothing. This is what he says. If you jump down to verse 9. So now that you know God, why do you want to underline this, go back? And that's what chapter 4 is about. Why do you want to go back? Have you ever wanted to go back and do something different? Maybe. Remember last Sunday, Mother's Day, I called my mom as I was driving and wished her a happy Mother's Day and reflected on some things that really God had shown me, reminded me of in the service. It's pretty cool. And I began talking to my mom, and she made that comment, if I could go back, maybe I would do some things different. But, she said, but this is where we're at now. And there's kind of this idea of Paul. He says, why do you want to go back? I mean, you have everything that heaven at disposal can give you, but you want to go back. And he says this, he says you want to go back to those useless spiritual principles of the world. That idea of spiritual principles carries this picture, these weak principles. It's like this. We teach our kids ABCs, right? And we hope that they get onto it, and so for a long time we go through the ABCs and the alphabets and try to teach those things. Well, what if years later, this is what Peter talks about, your own spiritual milk, but you should be on meat. So as a son then, he says, don't go back to those weak principles anymore. Don't go back to the ABCs, because why would you want to go back to the ABCs when you can begin to read the adult, get into the deep literatures? For instance, I like reading C.S. Lewis. Good stuff. So in essence, I'd be like saying, I'm going to leave C.S. Lewis and I'm just going to go back to learning the ABCs again. Why would you do that? The things that we're able to comprehend, the things that we're able to learn as we get deeper into it, the more that we experience grace in Jesus, the more we should look like Him. But no, Paul says, no, you want to go back. You want to go back into the slavery. You're trying to earn favor with God, he says, by observing certain days or months or seasons. Why do you want to go back? Can I pose that perhaps one of the reasons we like to go back is because we identify a moment that is familiar and comfortable. And we want to go back to that moment. And so they were comfortable. They were familiar. The law was what they knew, and they were familiar, and they were comfortable. But Paul's saying, why do you want to go back to that? Because we already talked in Galatians 3, all it does is make you a slave. It was only set there as a guardian until the moment came for Christ when He would then be the one that would follow. But now you want to go back. Here's the beautiful thing. Look, verse 9. This is what it says, now that God knows you. Now that you know God. Isn't that awesome? I mean, just for a moment, think about that. God knows you. Didn't Jesus say something like this? I will go to prepare a place for you, and I will come back so that you can be with me. I mean, there's nothing better, the inheritance, than to be known by God and to know God. But the church of Galatia, they were known by God, and yet they wanted to go back to something that all it did was cause more separation from really fully knowing God. Because we talked about this last week, they knew the law. The law was to show the holiness of God and the need for a Savior. And we talked about, we'll never be perfect by the law. You break one of it and you're done. The law was to show you can't do it. And we'll never have perfect relationship with God through the law. But through Jesus Christ, we have now been brought close and been given sonship. And so Paul's saying, why do you want to go back? In essence, you're leaving the family to go back to being an orphan. Why? But many people do this. How? Well, let's look at it. Look there in verse 10. You're trying to earn favor with God by observing certain days or months or seasons of the years. Do you know where we got this? You know, the opposite of Christianity is idolatry. People might say the opposite of Christianity is atheism. No. The opposite of Christianity is idolatry. Anything that takes away from God. And idolatry was the issue of the Israelites, the Old Testament. It was the thing they struggled with the whole time was making idols. Because why? They needed something to be able to see. And so we get here, and Paul says, now you're trying to earn something. You're trying to earn something that I've already told you has already been given to you for free. But now you're trying to earn it again. By doing what? practicing, observing these special days, these seasons, do you know where we get the people who follow the mindset that they only go to church on Easter and Christmas? Religion. I just talked to a lady last week, and as I was at the bank, and we talked about this, and she said, I do go to church on Easter and Christmas. And I'm like, well, that's all right, that's good, but... And she thought that was all she needed to have a good relationship. She said she was a devout. And I was like, really? I said, I think I want to tell my church that I'm just going to preach twice a year, and I'm going to be a devout pastor. How's that sound to you guys? You know where we get the idea from for people is think that all I got to do is practice something. It's right here. Paul identified it. It's religion. Religion teaches us. All you got to do is these certain things, and it makes you perfect before God. But here's what Paul's saying. By trying to do that, you know what you steal? The joy that the Lord wants to give you. Because here's what happened. I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to skip some dialogue that Paul's going to have here with the church. But I want you to catch this in verse 15. He talks about this church that used to have all these things they did, and he remembers the enthusiasm. But he says, where is the joyful and grateful spirit you felt then? You know what legalism has done to the church? It has stole the joy in people. When there's people within congregations that follow legalism, we steal right away from people joy. Because we fall back into, oh, well, what do I need to do? What can I not do? Or what can I get away with and still be a Christian? You ever hear these questions before? All those stem from religion. It all stems from legalism. What do I have to do? All of this steals away joy from people, the gratefulness of what God has already done, salvation. And so the church of Galatia fell away from the joy that they had that Paul once identified in them because the people began to fall back into what do I need to do to earn all this? They lost sight. And it's an issue even today for people. And all I can say is grab a hold of what Jesus has already done and quit trying to do. Rejoice in the salvation that He has provided. And then live set free in the midst of that. Let me read to you 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5. Yeah, there we are. It says, they will act religious, but they will reject the power that could make them godly. Stay away from people like that. They act religious, but they will reject the power that could make them godly. I want you to think about something with me. As Paul points out, there's a religious background that denies the power. We can go to church, we can sing songs, we can pray, we can study. We can go through all those things, and people will do that just to try to earn righteousness with God, try to earn that right position with God. So Paul's saying, you're trying to earn something, favor now. But let me show you something. By doing these things in themselves, it's no different. And this is what Paul is going to point out. This is what the Gentiles were doing. The Gentiles were serving idol gods. They were serving, Paul dealt with this in Athens. He goes through and he sees all these idol gods and things that they worship. Paganism. And Paul in Galatians is going to contribute the Gentiles and the Jews. Legalism and paganism, he says, you're pretty much doing the same thing. Wow. What's wrong with that? Well, let me show you. When we try to practice religion without power, you can say that you pray. Well, so do Muslims. What, 5 times a day? 3 times a month? I mean, they pray all day. I worship. Hindu. You ever look at Hinduism? Strong worship. We can say that we study. Well, so do Jehovah's Witnesses, and they do pretty good at it. Or we can say we do missions. Well, so do the Mormons, and we're really good at it. So the idea of religion, the idea of legalism is found that to have it without power is nothing. And Paul says what is counted is to realize that I live in the power and operate through Jesus. Because none of that other stuff is going to matter. Trying to do all that to earn something isn't going to do it. You need to set yourself into what Christ has already done. And then live in the freedom that Jesus brought you. And so I took away some prayers from this. From Galatians chapter 4. Father, teach us as children that we're in a relationship with you. Teach us to treasure your truth. Paul was so thankful for the truth, verses 12 through 16. Father, make us like your Son. Look at verses 17 through 20. This is what he said. He goes through and talks about the joy that was gone and the false teachers that were eager to win them over, and their intentions were not good. And so he says that I'm in child pain, I'm in labor pains again, that you'll continue until Christ is fully developed in you. Do you pray that Christ will be fully developed in you, and that Christ will be fully developed into your children, into your neighbors, into co-workers? Do you feel such a burden and a pain that people would know Christ, that Christ would be in them? And Paul has such an agony for this. Listen to this. He says, I wish I were with you so that I could change my tone. But at this distance, I don't know how else to help you. The desperation. I want to help you so bad to know that Jesus is what you need, but I'm not there. I can only say so much in a letter. But will you hear me? Will you hear me? Quit going back. Going back doesn't make it any better. Going back doesn't give you power. Going back only puts you back into bondage. Keep going forward until Christ is in you. Father, help us to rejoice in salvation. Verses 21 through 30, and that's where we're going to look at our final thing here. And so he's going to use the story of Abraham and the two children. He says, do you really know what the law says? The scriptures say that Abraham had two sons. One from a slave wife and one from a free-born wife. The son of the slave was born in a human attempt to bring about the fulfillment of God's promise, but the son of freedom's wife was born as God's own fulfillment of his promise. And these two women serve as an illustration of God's two covenants. The first woman, Hagar, represents Mount Sinai, where people received the law that enslaved them. And now Jerusalem, just like Mount Sinai area, because she is the children who live in slavery to the law. But the other woman, Sarah, represents the heavenly Jerusalem, which we see in Revelation. And she is the free woman, and she is our mother, as Isaiah said. Rejoice, childless woman, you have never given birth. Break into joyful shout. You have never been in labor, for you desolate woman now has more children than the woman who lives with her husband. And you, dear brothers and sisters, are children of the promise, just like Isaac. But you're now being persecuted by those who want you to keep the law, just as Ishmael, the child born by human effort, persecuted Isaac, and the child born by the power of the Spirit. But what do the scriptures say about that? Get rid of the woman, the slave woman, and her son, for the son of the slave woman will never share in the inheritance with the free woman. And so, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman. We are children of the free woman. The story of Sarah and Hagar is a picture, a spiritual picture. Why does he use this here? Because he wants to reveal to the Galatians the spiritual picture of performance versus provision. Of people who try to perform to a certain level. If I do it well enough, then God will accept me. If it looks just like this, if I do it like this, God will love me. Man, it breaks my heart when I meet people who are trying to perform just to receive the love of God. And then I just simply stop and say, John 3:16, God already loves you. That He sent His Son to die for you. And they're like, oh, it can't be that easy. Yeah, it is. It really is. And people wrestle with that. People struggle with that. And so He's going to use a story, Sarah and Hagar. He's going to show this spiritual picture of the people that say, I must make it happen, versus I will trust God to make it happen. Turn back to Genesis chapter 15 with me as I read a couple of these with you to show the story, to make the spiritual connection. So Genesis chapter 15, I'm just going to read a verse here. So the Lord begins His covenant promise with Abram. He says in verse 4, Then the Lord said to him, No, your servant will not be your heir. Remember, he has no son, but he's going to have God just told him, you're going to have an inheritance that's as numerous. It's going to be amazing. And Abraham's like, wait a second, I don't have any kids. So who's this going to go on to? Am I going to have to get a servant? He says, no. You will have a son of your own who will be your heir. That's the beginning. You do not have to have a servant. You will have a son that will be your heir. Jump over to chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had not been able to bear children, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed to Sarai's proposal. So here's what the Spirit reminded me about this. Because they did not see the possibility of the promise. God already promised you're going to have a son. Because they didn't see the possibility of the promise, they went to a servant. They went to a slave. That same wording in Galatians 4 about the servant or being a slave, this is what we're talking about. He's using the spiritual implications of the story of Abraham and Sarah to show us that when we doubt the promise, we go to the slave. What's the slave? The law. Keeps us as slaves. Look at chapter 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you by which I will guarantee to give you countless descendants. So who are you? Are you the I must make it happen, or are you I will trust God to make it happen? And so there's two sons that are born, one from Hagar, which is named Ishmael, and one that's from Sarah, which is named Isaac. And these two births indicate this, that they illustrate the physical, which makes us sinners, and the spiritual, which makes us children of God. Because one came from the slave Hagar, one came from the free woman Sarah. One came through who the promise was supposed to be given. The promise was supposed to be given through Sarah, not Hagar. But when they said, oh, we can't do this, Sarah said, well, let's go to my servant, let's go to my slave Hagar, and let's do it with that. Let's make it happen. It was never supposed to go through Hagar. It was supposed to go through Sarah. That was the promise. It was never supposed to be the final law. It was supposed to be the law pointed to the Messiah. We talked about this last week, that people lost sight of the provision of the promise, and so what do? They relied on the law, and they said the law is what we have to do. But Paul says, but Abraham lived by faith in the promise. So why are we still getting caught up with living by the law? The Jews now get stumped into their own history. And so Abraham's marriage with Hagar to have something was outside of God's will as a result of unbelief. And so hence, trying to do something into which should never have happened, compared to if we would live by faith in the promise. So what are you doing? How are you living? And so Genesis 16:12 tells us that Ishmael was a wild man that not even his parents could contain him. And so Isaac in Ishmael is a picture in Galatians chapter 4. Paul's trying to get us out. There's a picture between the old nature, the flesh, which is at war with God. We've been living a war, a physical war of Ishmael and Isaac between Muslim and Christian since that point. Now Paul's going to say, and that is the image that we get spiritually, that Ishmael represents the old nature that is at war with God and always will be at war with God. And so we have to look then to Isaac and the promise of Isaac. And so Genesis 21 is where we quote from Galatians 4 at the end there in verse 30. It said, so get rid of the slave woman and her son. This is Genesis 21, when Hagar is casted out along with Ishmael, because it is impossible for grace and the Spirit to compromise and live together with the law. They can't stay together. You can't try to live by the law and grace at the same time. Because that's what was being taught to the church of Galatia. Let's try to live this thing by both. And so in verse 9, Paul says, to invite them back is to invite ourselves back into slavery. And so we, as believers, are not members of the let's make it happen in our own way family. We're part of let's trust the promise family. So are you trusting in the promise of Christ to live free? And so a song came to me as I was studying this, and the song was, I am who you say I am. And that's in essence what chapter 4 is about. I am who he says I am. Not what my past says I am. I'm not what the people, religions say I am. I am because of who Jesus says I am, because of what he did. Can I tell you, that is what sets you free. Not performance, but the provision of a promise. It's a beautiful image of the Scripture. So we're going to turn our hearts to sing this morning now. I'm going to invite you to stand with me as I pray. Spirit, as we think about what your word in Galatians 4 tells us, why are you going back? Why are we trying to go back to something now that is a performance base? Maybe if I do this, this, and this, I'll, God will notice me, and God will love me. But why can't we remind ourselves of what Jesus has done? That the promised child has come. The one that, the provision that was given by faith has come. And we don't live out of the slavery anymore. We're in the line of the lineage through Isaac that is free. Our new home is the new Jerusalem. That's where we're going to be in Revelations when it says, in the new heaven and new earth, the new Jerusalem. That is where we'll be. And so we keep moving forward. He who began this work in us is faithful to complete it. And we can live in freedom every day through Jesus Christ. We don't have to go back to something. And so this morning, if someone here, Holy Spirit, if someone here has been struggling with that or has struggled
I want them to know, I want you to just remind them right now of the joy that comes when we're in relationship with you. Remind them of the joy. And as we sing this song, I am chosen. We're a son, given every inheritance, everything that comes with it. You set us free from slavery so that we could step into, not go back. And we want to live in that inheritance that you have given us through the promise. And so right now, as we proclaim in the words of our mouth through this song, we're declaring right now, I'm a child of God. We're not like the older son in the story of the prodigal son. The older son, you remember? He said, I have slaved. He told his father, I have slaved all these years for you. He himself, we look at the younger son, but the older son also was in bondage and slavery. He too lived in his father's house and didn't realize the inheritance that he had. So we can live it and we can be around it and not realize the inheritance that is ours. And so we want to step into today the grace of Jesus Christ to open our eyes so that we can see with eyes what you have graciously given us. We are yours, and you are ours. And we thank you for that relationship. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.